I think it's valuable to understand why philosophical problems are as fraught as they are, as hard as they are, as perennially and persistently disputed as they are. So there's value in understanding why philosophical problems are hard problems. And I do think that sometimes, to some extent, we get at least partial resolutions of them. And so then we have that further kind of understanding.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Terence Horgan. He is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, and his work has covered a wide range of topics in metaphysics, epistemology, mind, metaethics, and more. His books include, but aren't limited to, Austere Realism, the Epistemological Spectrum, Essays on Paradoxes, and he's also written a great number of articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Horgan.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so there's a lot of things I want to, or at least a fair amount of things I want to get into. One thing I did want to start with, actually, though, is some of your work on metaethics. And a point you've made is regarding moral phenomenology, is that we can have certain moral experiences, so to speak. It's possible to experience something as, for example, as an authoritative moral reason to do something. What sort of experiences are these? For myself, at least, I don't think I would describe any of the experiences I've had in that way, or I don't know that any experiences I've had should be counted as such. Am I missing the relevant sort of moral phenomenology, or am I just not recognizing the experiences I've had as those sorts of experiences? Or what would you say about this?
I'm guessing you're probably missing it and you're really having it. Virtually everything I do in metaethics, I do jointly with my colleague, Mark Timmons, and we've been working together for many years. We have a recent paper called Gripped by Authority, where we discuss this issue. I mean, many in metaethics want to claim that moral judgments have a certain kind of distinctive authority over us. And many want to try to argue that this fact is difficult for some metaethical positions to accommodate. Timmons and I advocate a form of expressivism, an anti-realist metaphysical view. And so we've been concerned to try to argue that the relevant kind of experience, the authority experience, is compatible, at least with our version of expressivism. We have a recent paper called Gripped by Authority, and what I'll do is mention an example that we focus on to try to get the reader in line with what we're talking about. It's a fictional example from a book by Ian McEwan called Amsterdam. And late in this book, he's got a protagonist, not especially admirable protagonist, as it turns out, who's a composer. And late in his career, he's seeking to compose a symphony, which he's thinking of as kind of a grand finale to his career, to be performed at a big event in Amsterdam. And he's having trouble coming up with the way the finale to this symphony should go. And so he's left town, he's off in the woods, pondering it, trying to get this finale to go right in his mind, thinking about it. It feels to him as though he's just about there, he's just getting it. And suddenly he hears a woman screaming, and he finds himself looking onto a scene down below where a man and a woman are struggling with each other. And along the way, it gets more serious. She tries to run. He grabs her by the ankles and she falls. She's screaming. It's clear that this is a bad situation for the woman. he really does not want to intervene in this situation because he mainly feels that doing so would make him lose this finale that is finally just forming in his mind. And the way the scene is written, he ends up not going down there. And he ends up giving himself excuses which seem pretty clearly to be just excuses, just rationalizations. And in fact, he's portrayed thereafter as feeling pretty substantially guilty about what he did, even though he's pretending to himself that he isn't feeling guilty about it. The thing there is he really didn't want to do it. So the sense of obligation to do it was one that he felt gripping him quite independently of his pre-existing desires, and actually contrary to his pre-existing desires, because he really wanted to just remain alone and focus on this project of his. So the way he was gripped by the felt moral obligation to go down there, a moral obligation which in fact he did not act on, is what we take to be a fairly vivid example of the relevant sort of authority. It's most vivid in cases where it goes contrary in a vivid way to your pre-existing desires. So there's one case. It's a fictional case, but we take it to be a good one to prompt the intuitions we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's fair in a way. I feel like I might interpret that case as him having these competing desires or competing maybe emotional responses. I'm not sure I quite understand like what that sensation of being gripped by some, moral reason or authority really amounts to. Like, do you think we really need something more here than some maybe competing desires or something like that, or what would you say?
There are actually two ways you could run with our general position. One would be to say that these kinds of experiences give rise to new desires, and desires that at least typically that have a very substantial intensity to them. Another would be to say that these states already are motivational by their nature. We prefer the second. We find the second more plausible phenomenologically and also kind of simpler psychologically. But either way, the main thing would be that the being gripped by this moral authority is something that is experienced as independent of your pre-existing desires. It involves desire. It involves a new desire that arises out of the experience itself. Or, and we prefer this, the experience itself is inherently motivational.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to think about that a bit more. I suppose the former seems a little bit more plausible to me. It's like on the basis of certain experiences we have, we can often just develop new desires, and those might conflict with previous desires, and how we're motivated to act might be a complicated interplay between those desires and so on. But
this might be partly a verbal issue, depending on how broadly one is willing to use the word desire. And let me just also add that the dialectic that Timmons and I are in is one where many in metaethics are claiming that there is such a thing as this kind of experienced moral authority, and then are arguing that, for example, expressivist positions cannot adequately accommodate it. So in a way, somebody who doesn't even think they've got this kind of experience is standing outside the dialectic that we're primarily engaged in there.
Yeah, I guess for me, like my immediate response is I'm not really sure what these experiences are supposed to be. I guess in the example, like I can sort of picture myself in the position of Clive or whatever his name was, and I have those sorts of maybe conflicting desires and motivations, and maybe have some of the sensations maybe that he would have. I'm not sure what it means or what it adds, what we're adding when we're saying that it's the sensation of feeling gripped by some authority. But maybe I just don't really understand it, I guess.
So we are talking here about a fact, a situation. And the thought is that your awareness that the obtaining of this situation is constituting an experienced reason for you to act a certain way. And you're experiencing that fact as constituting such a reason in a way that's independent of your prior desires, exerting a certain kind of necessity demand on you, even if you end up not acting on it. And even if you don't act on it, you're still going to have the experience, and you're apt to have subsequent negative, self-directed, reactive attitudes like shame.
Right. Yeah. I'd have to think about it a bit more, but as you say, though, the view you and Mark Timmons have been developing is, you call it a sort of cognitivist expressivism. It's a non-reductivist view. And I take it the main kind of motivation for it, or at least part of the main motivation for it, is that it's best suited to provide an account which at the same time accords with this moral phenomenology you're kind of talking about, but also is consistent with like plausible metaphysics, and it preserves our existing moral practices. I guess first, like, do you want to talk about that? Like how you think this view is best suited in those regards, or?
Okay. Now we call it cognitivist expressivism because we want to claim that moral judgments expressively understood our way are a species of belief. Although one could embrace the view otherwise and question that particular part of it. But we say that they're a distinctive kind of belief. So we're thinking of beliefs as commitment states, psychological commitment states. And we say that there are basically two kinds. The familiar kind, what's commonly recognized as a belief, is in what we call an is commitment, a commitment to a given propositions being how things are in the world, right? A way that the world might be is a way that it actually is, according to your commitment. That's an ordinary belief. And moral judgments we call ought commitments. So it's a commitment with respect to a certain kind of non-normative potential state of affairs. And so it's an orienting, a taking up of a stance vis-a-vis such a potential state of affairs. And we want to say that because of its commitment nature in relation to a potential state of affairs, it's enough like ordinary beliefs to count as a kind of belief. But apart from that, and whether or not somebody buys that part of our story, the other thing we want to say is that the relevant states of mind that are these kind of ought commitments are distinctive and sui generis. They're phenomenologically distinctive, and they have a fairly distinctive functional role. They're not as much like, for example, desires or states of issuing a command, for example, commanding yourself to do something. They're not as much like that as traditional expressivists have tended to make it seem that moral judgments are supposed to be. They are sui generis, and part of the way that they're interestingly different from, say, just desires is that they have this grippingness aspect to them. Normally, a desire is not experienced as gripping you independently of your pre-existing desires. It's only gripping you as a desire that you have. And if you stopped having that desire, then the motivation would go away. The ought commitment state is different from that. Part of its phenomenology is, apart from all my desires, and even if I didn't desire this, it would still have authority over me.
And there is some similarity with desires there, though. Like,
yes.
For example, there's sort of, you might talk in this Searlean way, this world to mind direction of fit or something like that. You want to, for it to be satisfied in some way, the world would have to become a certain way, or you have to do something. But maybe the relevant difference there is this grippingness, because I don't think necessarily it's built into desires that they're gripping the sort of in this way, independent of the desire that you have.
Yeah, that's how we think about it. And we also think that normal, ordinary desires are not actually commitment states, right? So being committed in a certain way is distinctive and different from typical desires. So part of what we try to do in making sense of moral judgments as sui generis, we don't try to reductively make them too much like other states of mind, but instead we try to discuss ways that they are both similar and different from various types of mental state, like ordinary beliefs, like desires, like self-directed commands, like intentions and the like. And then also associated with their distinctive phenomenology is a distinctive kind of functional role in cognitive economy. And part of the distinctive functional role is somewhat similar to desire. They're motivationally hot in ways that normal beliefs are not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you would say that there is an important difference between this gripping feature and motivation, right? Could you have one without the other, or what is the difference, would you say?
Sure. Ordinary desires do motivate, but there isn't this aspect of, desire independence. They motivate as desires that you have. And if you didn't have the desire, then the motivation wouldn't be there. On the other hand, with moral judgments, and this is something that other expressivists have emphasized too, in particular, Alan Gibbard has, there's this kind of over againstness to it. I mean, over against my hypothetical possible self. When I'm judging that, I really ought to go down there and help that woman in distress, part of the character of the experience is that would be so regardless of whether I wanted to at all or not, right? And even if I weren't in this state, the fact that grips me is one that it binds me over against hypothetical selves and hypothetical situations where I'm not motivated. Does that make sense? Kind of hypothetical over against binding force. Yeah.
Right. So it's not, it still would be binding even in other situations, or if you had different desires or whatever.
Right. Yeah, that's part of the character of the experience itself.
Right. And a couple of other things on this. One, I did want to mention, someone might think, you say cognitivist expressivism, isn't that just like a contradiction? How can those things be reconciled? Or is it really sort of, if it's something belief-like, is it really expressivism? But if it's expressivism, yeah, how would you say those things are consistent?
Well, we're wanting to say that the thought that they're inconsistent is predicated on an assumption that all beliefs are descriptive beliefs. In effect, we call is commitments. And we're wanting to say that there are enough similarities between these states we call ought commitments and ordinary beliefs that these ones deserve to count as beliefs. And those who object and say that there's some sort of a oxymoron in the expression cognitivist expressivism have an unduly narrow notion of belief in mind. But then again, as I said earlier, that part of our picture could be jettisoned by somebody who might retain the rest of it. They might say, okay, there are these sui generis states that you call ought commitments, and they don't have in the world metaphysical realist purport concerning putative in the world moral properties. So it's a irrealist position. And these are the states of mind that are expressed when you utter a moral sentence. And thus it's a version of expressivism, whether or not you're willing to grant that it's really cognitivist. But we think it's distinctively different from other kinds of expressivism anyway, because of the emphasis we put on the sui generis nature of these states of mind. We think that other expressivists, early and more recent, assimilate moral judgments and the relevant states of mind. They assimilate them too closely to states of mind like desires or forming an intention or giving yourself a command or making a plan. They're, according to Timmons and me, these states of mind are more distinctively different.
Yeah, there might be partly a like semantic issue because like if we take the broader view of belief that you want, that these would count as a sort of belief or belief-like state, I guess, then someone might want to say, well, that's not really an expressivism because you're having something relevant like a belief, but it's still like expressivism in some ways. So you would say that's just kind of a matter of terminology, or would you say there's a substantive dispute there?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting general question when a dispute is merely terminological and when it's substantive. My general attitude on that is that sometimes there really is a fairly determinate fact of the matter about how we actually use concepts that might be different from how we theorize about them. And so maybe there's a fact of the matter about how we use the concept of belief, under which Timmons and I are right? And people who theorize about beliefs in such a way that according to them, there couldn't be the kinds of beliefs that we're calling beliefs, are not tracking actual usage properly. So I'm not super sanguine about conceding that an issue is merely verbal, because I think that sometimes facts about actual usage might favor one position over the other. And I'm inclined to think that's what I would say about this case.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. And one more thing on this, sort of a key element to your position here is that you want to deny the entailment between having these authoritative, compelling rightness of reasons and so on, to there being sort of robust external normative properties or states or something like that. Can you talk a bit more about how, I guess this is sort of what you've been getting into, but for people who think you really need those external things for these to be authoritative in the right way, like how would you respond to them? Yeah.
Yes, it appears to us that many people who emphasize this aspect of authoritativeness, and this includes error theorists, by the way, like Jonas Olsson. He thinks that the most important feature of actual moral judgments and moral experience, the one that motivates him to be an error theorist, is that they have this aspect of authority, and that there's no such thing as authoritative in the world properties. And many non-naturalist realists think so. Now they think, both Jonas and non-naturalist realists, for example, like William Fitzpatrick, to mention one, we take it that they think that you can pretty well tell directly, introspectively, reliably, that the relevant kind of authoritativeness experience has content in it purporting to attribute in the world properties of a kind that have, built-in to-be-doneness in them. Another person who I think thought so, this is a classic version of error theory, was J.L. Mackie. He said, well, that's the character of the experience, and such properties would be intolerably weird metaphysically. Queer was his word, and so he was an error theorist too. Now, we think that it's too quick to think that the relevant phenomenology clearly has that kind of metaphysical purport. We don't say that you can tell introspectively that it doesn't. Our claim is that introspection is somewhat limited in its power here, that you can't really tell reliably just on the basis of introspection whether or not the authoritative aspect of moral judgment experience carries with it what we call ontological realist metaphysical purport. And for our purposes, that's enough, because as long as introspection can't tell reliably one way or the other, then it's open that the experience doesn't really have that kind of purport. And then we bring to bear considerations outside of introspective phenomenology in favor of our position. You know, it would be rather extravagant and metaphysically weird for there to be such properties. So yes, that aspect of our position is quite important. We use the expression, the neutrality thesis, by which we mean that introspection is actually neutral on whether or not authoritativeness experience has ontological realist metaphysical purport. It's neutral in the sense that you can't reliably tell. There may well be a fact of the matter about that, but you can't reliably tell introspectively.
Right. And that kind of allows you to, in a way, kind of have your cake and eat it too, right? On the one hand, you get to keep the sort of authoritativeness and grippingness of moral reasons, but without having to necessarily commit to some might say implausible metaphysics or something like that. And that's why that's why I think the view is pretty compelling, or at least part of it. Yeah. Let's see. Did want to move on. You mentioned some stuff briefly about concepts, and you do have this other article, relatively short, called on the paradox of analysis, and that has to do with, you know, apparent problem in conceptual analysis, because it's not clear how some analysis of a concept can be both correct and informative, since correct analysis will just, in principle, should just report what a particular concept means, and that's something that shouldn't be really informative to us. I just mean certain things by it, and if we're just reporting that, then, you know. And that paper was with Mark Balaguer, and I think the main point that you make is that meaning facts, or how we're using a concept, or it's like application conditions and so on, are in some sense empirical. How we're using a particular concept, what we're applying it to, or whatever, is in some sense is an empirical question. It could have turned out a different way, and so on. Is that roughly how you're putting the thought that it can be, conceptual analysis can be both correct and informative, or how might you explain it?
Yeah, the empirical aspect is a part of it. Let me add another couple elements that we think are central here. What is it to understand the meaning of a word? And what is it to have full, proper mastery of or ordinary mastery anyway, of a concept that the word expresses? Well, we're thinking basically it's a matter of having an adequate set of dispositions to apply the word and the concept correctly under a sufficiently wide range of circumstances. At least apply it correctly relative to your available evidence. Sometimes your evidence might mislead. As long as you have that kind of, application competence, then you know what the word means, and you have conceptual mastery of the concept in question. Now, that's a different matter from actually knowing discursively what the satisfaction conditions are for the concept, which maybe have sharp, necessary, and sufficient conditions, maybe don't, but in any event, knowing what the satisfaction conditions are is a somewhat different thing. And it's a thing that we don't think is really required in order for you to have the relevant kind of mastery and competence, which is what we would normally call knowing the meaning. And so in addition, we think that it is thus in general, it's going to be an empirical question what the satisfaction conditions are for any given concept. Like, for example, the concept of free will, to take one that is of great interest to philosophers. Now, we certainly have traditionally thought in philosophy, especially in the analytic tradition, that conceptual analysis is an a priori business. And we've tended to think that as an a priori business, the issues are not empirical. Well, Balaguer and I think that there's something somewhat wrong-headed about this. And we mentioned work that I've done with David Henderson. And Henderson and I have coined a phrase, low-grade a priori. And what we mean by low-grade a priori is that it's a kind of inquiry that can be conducted basically in the armchair. But it's actually empirical inquiry nonetheless. Why? Because the principal kind of data, empirical data that is informing your inquiry while you sit in the armchair is your own intuitions. Your intuitions about actual and possible hypothetical scenarios, for example. And we see this as similar to what a linguist might do, consulting his or her own intuitions about whether certain strings of words are grammatical or ungrammatical, or grammatically ambiguous. They're using themselves as a source of data on the presumption that the data that emerges is the product of their own competence. So that's the sense in which, on our view, Balaguer in my view, and also Henderson in my view, conceptual analysis is actually an empirical enterprise. And the questions about what the satisfaction conditions of a given concept are typically empirical questions. It's just that some of the most important and most central data is intuitions about cases. And these you can generate in yourself while sitting in the armchair, especially if you're good at thinking up, illustrative, hypothetical, thought experimental scenarios like Hilary Putnam's Twin Earth and Gettier's famous cases about justified true belief that don't seem to count as knowledge and so forth.
Yeah, very interesting. So would you put it this way, that part of what a concept is that you have, how do I put this? Part of what determines sort of the details of the concept is how you're disposed to apply it or something like that. And how you're disposed to apply it is a sort of empirical matter that you can often figure out by gauging your intuitions, considering the cases where you actually apply it or don't, and so on. And figuring out those facts is empirical, right? In a way, is that how you put it?
Yes.
Yeah, that does seem right to me. I guess one potential concern someone might have with this is that, if you consider a case like knowledge, for example, and you've thought of all the, there might be the cases where you've applied it, maybe you have some general description of the concept that you can give in other terms. And when you consider new cases or further intuitions you have, like, Gettier comes along and presents this case, someone might think that you're not really elaborating the concept you already had, but maybe just like expanding on it in a way, because maybe the concept previously wasn't developed to cover cases like this, and now that you've developed a sort of intuition, now it does. Maybe the point here is pretty, could be put this way. It's like, how do we decide which sort of intuitions we have are already sort of built into the concept we have, and which ones are like where you're using to expand or develop a further concept? Maybe I didn't put that the best way, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yes, I do. I think that's a very good question. And I actually think myself that there are cases in philosophy where what's really happening is along the lines of what you're saying, even if the participants in the debate don't quite see it that way. I mean, I think that certain debates in metaphysics are actually rather like that. Now, how do you decide? Well, my general thought is that the methodology that is at work in much philosophical theorizing is not that different in principle from what goes on in a lot of scientific theorizing, even though data tend to be frequently closer at hand and even accessible in the armchair. Okay, you get a bunch of intuitions and they feed in as data. Does that mean that all of them are going to end up being respected by the resulting theory? No, I mean, some of them might end up being ruled out as we engage in what I think of as basically non-demonstrative, wide reflective equilibrium methodology, which is heavily abductive, inference to the best explanation. So, maybe there's a sort of default presumption that intuitions that you have about conceptual and semantic matters are correct because they're the product of your own competence. But it's only a default presumption. In some cases, you might end up, after you're doing wide reflective equilibrium and looking for best explanation, you might end up explaining away some of these intuitions as most plausibly understood as errors, maybe quite subtle errors, but errors nonetheless. I've invoked that kind of idea in some of my writings. I mean, just to mention one quick example of that. There's a huge literature in philosophy of mind that largely traces back to my own mentor from graduate school, Jaegwon Kim, about what Kim called the problem of causal exclusion in philosophy of mind. If your mental state are not just literally identical to brain states, well, brain states are doing all the causal work with respect to what you think and what you do and your behavior. And doesn't that mean that mental states as such have their causal efficacy excluded? And don't we have a big worry about them all being epiphenomenal and not being causally efficacious? I'm inclined to think that that is an important intuition that's best explained away rather than honored when we do the relevant kind of theorizing.
Right. Yeah, that's another big topic, of course. But I did want to, let's see. I'm not sure if I wanted to say something more on this or move on to something else. I guess I'll move on. Maybe we'll come back to some related things. Because I really did want to talk about some of your work on Newcomb's problem. It's something that I've had for a while, a fair amount of interest in. And I'm a pretty diehard one boxer in these problems, and it seems that you are as well, although surprisingly, at least to me, there's a relative, or at least moderate majority in the field of those working in the field that prefer causalist or two boxing approaches. And I guess just maybe as a first general question about the field, why do you think that is? Why do you think that two boxing has become, if not the dominant view, the more common view among those working on decision theory and Newcomb's problem in specific?
I'm not sure I have a direct answer to why it has become the more common view or the dominant view. But let me say a couple of things about how I view the two positions. I've come to think, I mean, when I started off, I thought I was, as to use your phrase, I was a diehard one boxer. I thought the one boxers were right, the two boxers were wrong, and there was a way to establish that. And in the first paper I wrote called Counterfactuals of Newcomb's Problem, I thought I had an argument against the two boxers. I later came to think that my argument against the two boxers was really just a kind of fancy bells and whistles reiteration of one box reasoning. And I came to think, in agreement with David Lewis, who said this early on in his landmark paper, Causal Decision Theory, he said he thought that Newcomb's problem is a stalemate. And so he wasn't going to try to adjudicate. He was just going to develop a form of decision theory that would serve the two-box approach. I came to agree with him that the problem was a stalemate. And beyond that, I came to think it's not just a stalemate. The seminal paper on Newcomb's problem was written by Robert Nozick, and he starts his paper with a quotation from Kant. And that quotation is Kant talking about what Kant called antinomies. And antinomy comes from the Greek, I guess, antinomos, conflicting laws, conflicting principles. And Kant thought, and Nozick was adopting this idea, that there's an antinomy here, which is an unavoidable illusion. Kant thought of antinomies, what he called antinomies, the kind that he discussed in his Critique of Pure Reason as antinomies. He thought of them as conflicts that are sort of unavoidable in our thinking, but they're illusions. They're illusions because we're trying to do something we shouldn't do. We're trying to apply concepts to the world as it is in itself, which is a sort of illicit thing to do. So they're unavoidable illusions. And Nozick intimates in his paper that the thing about one boxing is that it involves the unavoidable illusion that you have some causal control over you, what will, whether you will or won't get money, and how much you'll get, whereas you don't. Now, what I think is that there's a deeper kind of antinomy than a Kantian antinomy. I call it a deep antinomy, a real, not merely illusory, but a genuine conflict between normative principles that really are partly governing, partly constitutive of the relevant concept. In this case, the concept is, basically practical rationality. Right? So I think that there are principles that are partly constitutive that dictate two boxing, and there are principles that are partly constitutive that dictate one boxing. So although I remain a one boxer, I'm not a happy face one boxer, because I think that Newcomb's problem is a deep antinomy of practical reason. So given that, there's something that two boxers are right about. They're glomming onto the normative aspect that is partly governing the notion of practical reason, which in this problem dictates two boxing. And there's something that the one boxers are right about. They're glomming onto another normative aspect, also applicable, that dictates one boxing. Now that explains why there are both camps out there and why they both persist as vigorously as they do. It doesn't explain why the majority of those who think about decision theory, at least in philosophy, gravitate toward two boxing. And I'm not sure I know what to say about that.
Yeah, that's fair. So but on this normative aspect of rationality, or how, as you put it, it seems at least some on both sides are going to say, oh, the norms that the other side is appealing to are mistaken in some way, or I guess there's a couple of responses you can have. One is to say that the other norms are sort of mistaken. They're not really, that's not what real rationality requires or anything like that. The other response is to say, okay, those are genuine norms, but my norms are stronger or something like that, or they're more compelling or something of that nature. Or maybe there's some other response that I haven't thought of, but are you saying something like that latter one, or what would you say to someone who responded in the first way?
As far as I've gotten in wrestling with this issue, it's taking the second position. I'm wanting to say that both kinds of norms are actually constitutively parts of our ordinary notion of practical rationality, so that one boxers and two boxers are both correctly glomming onto something about how pertinent norms actually apply to the decision problem at hand. Why do I go with the one box one? Well, it's basically a psychological fact about me. And I like to put it in terms of regret. I would rather take only the one box, collect my $1 million, and then regret that I didn't take both, than take both boxes, collect my $1,000, and then regret that I'm the kind of person about whom the being would predict that I would take both boxes. And I don't put that forward as a normatively binding principle. I put it forward as a psychological fact about me. And I don't know what to say about whether there's some kind of overarching higher level normative principle that would adjudicate here. If there is one, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, but I could imagine people on both sides responding to these sorts of regrets, right? The two boxer might say, well, it's not really reasonable to regret that, you're the sort of person that the predictor would predict he would take two boxes, because that's not really something you have control over. At the very least, it wasn't something you had control over when the prediction was made or something like that. And the one boxer might say, on the other hand, I think I might say something like this: I'm not going to regret that I, quote unquote, left the 1,000 on the table, because, as I want to assess the relevant counterfactuals, had I not left it on the table, I probably would have received only that 1,000. And if that's how I'm evaluating things, that doesn't seem like cause for regret. So I don't know. It seems like both sides might have a response to the regret issue in principle. Or what do you think about
that? One thing, that this idea of using counterfactuals the way you're using them in a retrospective mode is something I had not thought about much before. I mean, I had thought about reasoning counterfactually, but while you're still trying to decide what to do. And it had seemed to me that it's fairly natural as a one boxer to use counterfactuals in advance the way you're talking about. If I were to take both boxes, then I would probably end up with only 1,000. And if I were to take just the one box, then I would probably end up with 1 million. On the other hand, retrospectively, I find myself, even as a one boxer, much more inclined to think about things counterfactually in the non-backtracking way of using a counterfactual. Well, I now know what the state of the opaque box was. And so I'm inclined to say retrospectively, gee, the $1 million was there. So if I had taken both boxes, I would have gotten 1,001,000. And that's why I'm now regretting moderately that I took only the one box. But also I have come to think that maybe the one boxer has a more basic kind of reasoning that doesn't involve counterfactuals. And I came to doubt whether counterfactuals are really the most central thing for various reasons, partly because of the fact that in the official version of the problem, you're not guaranteed that the being will correctly predict you. It's just supposed to be highly likely. So the way I now think of it is we're now going back. We're going back to your situation when you're deciding what to do. We're not thinking about it retroactively. Is in terms of what possibilities there are and what the likelihoods are, how likely these possibilities are. And I say, well, there are only two possibilities that are at all likely, namely that I take one box and end up with 1 million, and that I take both boxes and end up with 1,000. Those two possibilities are the only likely ones, and they're likely independently of what I decide to do. I don't know, regardless of my decision, those are the two likely possibilities, and they're highly likely independently of my decision, right? And so I should go with the possibility that has the better outcome for me, and that's taking the one box. That feels to me now like maybe the real core of the one box rationale, right?
Yeah, and I think you've made a somewhat similar point where you look in the limit case, right, where the predictor is infallible, and in that case, it's not just highly likely; it's just there really only are two possible outcomes. You take the one box and you get the million. You take both and you get 1,000. And in that case, I mean, clearly you should take the one box. I think even some two boxes are inclined to agree. But your point is that there's not really a relevant difference in rationality between that case and the case where it's, just about, but not exactly infallible. And so we should give the same verdict there. I know there have been some thoughts in the literature on this sort of topic. So some have even said in the infallible case, it's not really a genuine decision problem. Some have said, oh no, we still really should two box in this case because the arguments still go through. At least some of them. Others will try to say, no, there is a relevant difference between them and adopt this sort of discontinuous strategy. One box in the infallible case, two box otherwise. It seems to kind of exhaust the options. I don't find really any of them very plausible, but I don't know. What do you think of some of those approaches that two boxes could in principle take to this case?
Right. Well, it certainly seems to me that the basic two box reasoning is just as applicable in the limit case as in the other cases. You can still say to yourself, well, regardless of whether the money's there or not, I'll do better by 1,000 by taking both boxes. You can say that even if the predictor is guaranteed to predict correctly. On the other hand, it does seem an especially hard bullet to bite to say that in the limit case. I think it's interesting that Nozick, in his original paper, he was pretty clearly leaning toward two boxing for all the non-limit cases. But toward the end of the paper, he more or less says it would be crazy to take the two box choice in the limit case. And then he immediately turns around and scratches his head. What's the difference between probability 1 and probability 0.99999? And he doesn't even try to answer that question. So from my point of view, right there, for example, in that first paper on the Newcomb's problem that was published, you see some appreciation of these competing normative principles, which I say are both in play. And that's why I think, in effect, he was manifesting a kind of partial appreciation of the fact that we're dealing with a deep antinomy here.
Right. And another sort of argument you've given is to make the case more extreme and see what intuitions people have there. So like you described this case where you're like a starving prisoner or something, and in the transparent box, it's like there's a delicious meal, and in the opaque box, there's a note, that would free you from, there could be, there's either nothing or there's a note that would free you from a death sentence you would otherwise receive, or something like that. And it's placed there if and only if you're predicted to take only that box, and so on. So like structurally, this is really just the same as the regular Newcomb's case, except the stakes have been raised, so to speak. And most two boxers, you think, would intuitively prefer one boxing in this case. And the fact that it's not really relevantly different than standard Newcomb's case seems to support one boxing there as well. I could think of two maybe possible responses that two boxers might have. One would be to just like bite the bullet, say, yeah, I should still take both in this case because all the same arguments still apply and so on. Even though they can sort of predict ahead of time that they're probably not going to receive the pardon or whatever it is. Another thing they could say is that to explain away sort of the intuitions, the one-boxing intuitions here, is that the stakes have been raised so much such that their uncertainty regarding rationality, like which decision theory is right, even if that's relatively small, leads them to prefer the safer option here. So I guess, yeah, what do you think of these replies that the two boxers might provide?
Right. Yeah, actually, it occurs to me that there's another version of the second reply. You might be somewhat uncertain about which decision theory is right. Or you might, even if not very uncertain, but the stakes are so high that that might give you reason to go ahead and be cautious and take just one box. Or you might be somewhat uncertain about the absolute reliability of the predictor, right? Well, is that relevant? Actually, now that I think about it again, I'm not sure that second one is relevant. Anyway, well, I think that the consistent two-boxer should say, yep, I would still take two boxes. My fate is already sealed, whatever it is. And if I don't take two boxes, I'm passing up a delicious meal. I also built into that version that the prisoner hadn't eaten for 3 days. So this was his favorite meal. Now, if you do that in the limit case, as a two-boxer, I guess you do so in the knowledge that you will subsequently be executed. But maybe you're saying to yourself, oh, well, my fate was sealed in advance. Now notice that if, on the other hand, you take only the one box in those circumstances, so you're passing up the meal, you do so in the knowledge that that box will have a note in it that commutes your sentence. So another thing that struck me about this version of the story was that it actually raises the philosophical question of how to understand the notion of what's in your power, what's under your control. Isn't there a palpable sense in which your fate is in your hands, right? If you take the one box in this circumstance, you do so in the certain knowledge that you will have your sentence commuted. And if you take both boxes, you do so in the certain knowledge that you'll be executed in the morning. And this knowledge does not arise either way until you act. So part of what struck me was the very notion of what's in our power comes into question here. But maybe that's not so surprising, because what's in our power is connected to practical rationality. And I'm wanting to say that Newcomb's problem is an antinomy of practical reason.
Yeah, it almost feels like the two boxer, even in that limit case, in this case, is like, it almost feels like sort of fatalistic reasoning. It's like there's nothing. It's like they don't even feel that they could do anything about that. It's almost like they couldn't make a choice at all. Like there's nothing they do that makes a difference at all to, well, couldn't make a difference. That's potentially loaded term, but to whether they are executed or not, or something like that. But
yeah, it does seem to be something like a fatalistic approach to things. I once was teaching a course with a former student named Doug Campbell. I was visiting in New Zealand, and we were teaching a course on paradoxes together, different paradox every session, actually. And we were talking about Newcomb's problem, and Doug and I came up with a scenario. I think it was mostly his inspiration that I really liked. It was like this. You're in a room you're sort of stuck in a room for quite a while. And there's a monitor there with a screen and a keyboard. And it turns out that it's a dummy monitor. It's not connected to the outside world at all. And you can sort of see through a one-way mirror another room where there's a artificially constructed creature who looks like you. Maybe it's a robot and has been pre-programmed, completely pre-programmed all of its behavior. And it's been pre-programmed by one of these Newcomb predictors. And so the Newcomb predictor has predicted what you're going to be doing while you're stuck in your room and has got this dummy robot behaving the same way. So, if you start dancing around in certain ways in the room, the dummy robot is behaving just like you. And you know this whole setup. So you know that there's no causal connection between you and the dummy robot. And you also know that your monitor is not connected to the outside world. Now, the dummy robot's monitor is connected to the outside world. So suppose you want something to eat, and you've been told, well, the way you can get something to eat would be if the robot on the other side of the one-way mirror types into his computer an order for food to be delivered to you, right? Otherwise, you won't get anything to eat. Well, if you just sit there and do nothing, you're going to starve to death. But if you sit down at your dummy monitor and start typing in what would normally appear to be, ordering online a delivery of a pizza from Domino's, sure enough, the dummy robot will be doing the same thing, and you'll get the pizza. And so your whole ongoing existence is a Newcomb environment. And isn't it palpable that you have some control over whether you're going to get any food or not? And it's all a matter of whether you do or don't type into the monitor, even though you know that the behavior you're engaging in is not causally efficacious. So there's this way of understanding what's in my power that goes beyond what we would normally think of as efficacy of my behavior. And to ignore that is very much like viewing the world fatalistically.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's like you're granting that you're not causing whatever exactly that means, the desired result, but you're acting so as to ensure or near enough the desired result. It kind of reminds me of maybe you're familiar with this paper from John Leslie called "Ensuring 2 Bird Deaths with 1 Throw" or something like that, and it's exploring basically a very similar idea. Like you imagine that there's a whole duplicate of the world, so to speak, where whatever happens on one side happens mirrored on the other side. And if you had one rock and you were thinking, well, I want to kill 2 birds, but I'm only able to like cause the death of 1 bird with this rock, or whatever. What would you do? Would you give up and do nothing? Or would you think, well, I could cause myself the death of 1 bird with this rock, and that will ensure that my kind of counterpart on the other side is going to do the same thing. And so the result would be that 2 birds would die. Weird example, but that's you could do what you could have be whatever. The idea is that, that's getting the result that I wanted, even though I'm only able to I'm not able to cause it fully.
That's very much in the same spirit as this thought experiment I was describing. I remember at least one time we had a philosopher give a talk at the University of Arizona. I don't remember her name now, but she was propounding a certain fairly distinctive view of causation. And I remember afterwards talking to her over beer. I think I gave her this kind of scenario, and I said, according to you, would that be causation? And I think her answer was yes. So, the very idea of what constitutes causal efficacy is maybe looming here as well. I mean, I had thought of it in terms of a notion of what's in my power that goes beyond causal efficacy, which is the way you and I were discussing it. But somebody could say, it's not utterly clear what counts as causal efficacy in scenarios like this anyway.
Yeah, maybe someone like her would be inclined to say that the Newcomb problem is inconsistent in a way, because the way it's described does entail that you have causal efficacy over the contents of the box or the prediction, but it's like stipulated that you don't. So in that way, it's kind of inconsistent. But to judge that, we'd have to get deeper in, well, what is causation, what counts as causal efficacy, and so on.
Yep, I now find myself motivated to put this question to my old friend and colleague from way back when, Jim Woodward, who writes about causation. Apparently has a new book on causation.
Yeah, he does. I'm trying to, was his like a sort of difference-making account, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a difference-making account, but I just saw a reference to it. I believe it's called Causation with a Human Face. And I think he, way back when, wrote a paper by that title. So maybe the whole thing has become a book now. We're getting a bit off topic, but not so much. I'll quickly describe an exchange I had with him once. I said, Jim, do you know of anybody who's ever made the claim that the notion of causation really has no place in fundamental physics, but that it does have plenty of applicability elsewhere, including in the special sciences? And Woodward said, yes, me. And he referred to his paper called Causation with a Human Face. And now I believe he's written a whole book with that same title. So I'm very curious what he would say about the scenario we just described.
Yeah, that's something worth checking out. I guess I have one more thing to comment on decision theory and Newcomb stuff, and then I want to talk about some other things before we run out of time. I don't know, because my approach, I think my main motivation for taking one box, I think, is fairly simple. I look at the details of the problem I at least take myself to face. I ask sort of what is likely to obtain if I act in various ways given those details. In Newcomb's problem, that's going to end up, I'm going to end up reasoning like a one boxer. I want to perform the action which, sort of given my evidence, is most likely to satisfy my preference. And especially if ahead of time I know that like acting in a certain way is predictably going to result in the worst outcome, which I think two boxing does, then that can't be the rational action, given how I'm thinking about rationality. I don't know. I guess I've said a couple of things here, but and maybe this reasoning is too simple to generalize to other cases, some of which you've written on. But do you think this is a reasonable approach in general?
Yes, I do. I think that basically is the apt one box rationale. And in fact, it's much like the way I've most recently tried to articulate the apt one box rationale myself. But I also think that there nonetheless remains this apt two box rationale, which is sitting there and hasn't been, rendered irrelevant or moot or obviously mistaken. Namely, look, the contents of the box is already determined and fixed, the opaque one. What I do isn't going to make any difference to the contents of the box. And I do better by $1,000 by taking them both. So the thing for me is that your rationale is apt and appropriate, and for me, very motivating. But I think the other rationale seems apt and appropriate too, although for me, not as motivating.
Yeah, I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is that I'm going to tie my notion of rational action to some certain basic principles or commitments. And I think that's probably the most basic one. I want to do the action which is most likely to end up with the desired result. We might spell the details a little bit more precisely than that. And if there's some other action or some other motivation which is sort of inconsistent with that, it's got to go, because this is the really most basic one to rationality as I'm thinking about it. And if someone has a different approach, then maybe there's no way to resolve any disputes that we might have, or at least some of the disputes that we might have. But then I guess I would say that their notion of rational action is sort of alien to me. If it's not trying to get the most desired results given your evidence or whatever, predictably speaking, anyway, then you're just not talking about the same sort of thing that I'm talking about, or something like that. I mean,
I go about 80% of the way there with you. But for me, the sense in which the one box rationale is the most basic one and the one that is going to trump feels like a psychological report about myself. What I would really like to get a clean solution would be some sort of compelling normative principle that adjudicates between these two competing ones. But that's what I so far despair of finding. And I think it's a credible hypothesis that there is no such normative principle. And so the very idea of what is the practically rational thing to do is an idea that I start to lose a grip on, because you've got these competing seeming normative principles that both seem to be applicable. And what I'm left with as to why the one is more basic is that one moves me more. And that's just a psychological fact. And I know, in fact, that the two boxers are moved more by the other one. I'd like to have a resolution via a compelling normative meta principle that adjudicates, but I so far despair of finding such a thing.
Yeah, I guess it's going to turn on whether you think that there's a sort of fact of the matter about what's rational, quote unquote, or what's practically rational, independent of, I don't know, how we choose to, what sort of norms we take to just kind of stipulate our constitutive rationality or something like that, or what sort of norms we're committed to. But then I guess maybe we do some sort of conceptual analysis, but I'm not sure that's gonna resolve the dispute, because perhaps you'll have people that are saying to take both boxes, and if you analyze their notion of rationality, at best you're going to end up with some, you might end up with some norms or some meta principle that's consistent with that, but different than the ones that you'd end up doing the conceptual analysis on the one boxers. So like, maybe the concern is that there isn't this general notion of rationality, or this almost like mind independent fact about what's kind of quote unquote rational that would potentially resolve the dispute. At least I would take to be a serious concern.
Yeah.
Possibility.
Just to tie all this Newcomb discussion back to what we were discussing earlier about metaethics, I mean, issues about normative realism and normative irrealism, metaphysically speaking, do loom, and they're wider than those issues as they arise in morals. So, for example, there are issues about whether you should be a realist, a metaphysical realist about epistemic norms. And these issues are somewhat parallel to the ones in metaethics, and this has been acknowledged by a variety of people, including expressivist irrealists like Gibbard and Blackburn. And that same possibility looms here. And maybe what's being hankered after is some kind of metaphysically realist meta norm. And if you're inclined toward irrealism and expressivism about normativity, you might have additional reasons to be dubious about that.
Right. Yeah. But that's another big topic. So I did want to talk also about issues in vagueness, which you've written at length on. And it's in your opinion, it's a somewhat underappreciated problem in philosophy. So many viewers will probably be familiar, but a sort of standard example of this problem is that, well, on one hand, if you had a man with no hair, for example, it would be true to say that he's bald. And plausibly, if you have a bald man with, except he had one additional hair, he would still be bald. One hair doesn't make a difference between being bald or being not bald. But then from those two statements, you can infer that, well, a man with one hair would be still bald, a man with two, and so on, such that a man with 1,000,000 hairs would still be bald. And surely that's inadmissible. And as I understand it, your basic approach, there's kind of two key elements that you've developed with, I'm not sure I could pronounce his name correctly, Matjas Potrach, something.
Matjaž Potrch.
Matjaž Potrch, okay.
Yeah.
But I tried. And that attempt is, that account is what you call transvaluationism. And it also involves the sort of contextualist approach to truth and semantics. So can you first explain kind of briefly the transvaluationist approach?
Right. I claim that there's a certain specific kind of logical incoherence that's built right into the very nature of vagueness. Timothy Williamson argued in his book on vagueness that people who hold that there's some sort of incoherence in vagueness, and I think it is believed, I think, that Frege thought so, for example. Williamson called them nihilists, sort of a bleakly negative view about the whole phenomenon. And being called a nihilist was what prompted me to name my view transvaluationism, because Nietzsche famously held that we should get beyond nihilism and embrace something that he called the transvaluation of all values. Plus, there was this approach called supervaluationism that was already out there. So hence the name, transvaluationism. The basic idea is that there's an inherent logical incoherence built right into vagueness, because there are certain operative normative principles, governing vague concepts and vague language that I call status principles. One of which is that if you've got a Sorites sequence and an item in the sequence has a particular status, vague status like baldness, the next one has the same status, on pain of drawing a sharp boundary, where vagueness by its nature doesn't have sharp boundaries. But there are other status principles too. Like if you've got a Sorites sequence, then initially you have items with a given status like baldness, and eventually you have items with a polar opposite status like non-baldness. Nothing has both statuses. Now, these kinds of status principles are not mutually satisfiable, and that is the sense in which vagueness harbors inherent logical incoherence. On the other hand, there are also what I call practice principles that govern correct affirmatory practice in language and in thought. And the interesting thing is that these status principles can be respected in a certain way in your affirmatory practice, because you can avoid affirmations that violate these mutually incompatible and actually normatively operative status principles. So don't declare on every item in a Sorites sequence. If somebody is marching you along, I call that the forced march. You have to refuse to pronounce on every item. And if and when you stop pronouncing, you have to insist that you're not stopping here to mark a boundary. You're stopping here because you've got to stop somewhere, and that's it, right? So in practice, we we can use vague concepts, and we can use them in ways that avoid direct violation of these status principles, even though the status principles are mutually unsatisfiable. So that's the guts of the transvaluationist approach. Contextual semantics, the basic idea there is that truth as a generic thing should be understood as correct affirmability under contextually operative standards of correctness. Now, this is semantic conceptual correctness, not epistemic correctness. And the thought is that very often, typically, in fact, I would want to say almost always, the contextually operative standards for correct affirmability are not direct correspondence standards. Under direct correspondence standards, there ain't no vagueness, right? Vagueness is just not part of what's going on. But vagueness is ubiquitous, even in most of science. And so on the view that Terence and I push, the things that we commonsensically take to be true very often are true. Existence claims included, tables, chairs, middle-sized dry goods, things which, if they were items in the mind-independent world, they were really part of the correct ontology of the world, would be vague. But given what I've said about vagueness, ontological vagueness is impossible because the world in itself can't be governed by mutually incompatible normative principles, right? Our thinking can, and our discourse can, as long as we engage in the practice that respects those principles and avoids direct violation of them. But ontological vagueness is impossible. And so even serious science, its truths are typically indirect correspondence truths.
Yeah. So these, I think I sort of understand. So the indirect correspondence truth, that certain statements we make are going to be true in part because of these certain norms regarding assertability or something like that, of which statements. Maybe I'm not putting it the right way, but it's something to do with facts fixed by the norms of our semantics or something like that. That if we're abiding by those, then some of those statements we make can be true. Is that more or less right, or how?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I started down this path a long time ago, but before I was really worrying about vagueness and its metaphysical import, I was worried about various kinds of putative entities that are posited all over the place in ordinary common sense discourse and thought, but that I was suspicious about metaphysically. Things like universities, corporations, nations, symphonies as a type of entity as opposed to token performances. And I came to think, well, you have trouble trying to squeeze these things into a plausible, maybe metaphysically, broadly speaking, materialist metaphysics. Well, it's because you're trying to take the discourse as ontologically committed to such things. Why not take a more loosey-goosey attitude toward truth? Truth is correct affirmability under contextually operative semantic standards. And those standards often work in such a way that there don't have to be items in the mind-independent world that answer to the posits of your thought and discourse. And here I was thinking of posits like universities, corporations, states of the union, nations, And I here's a kind of thought experimental scenario I like. You imagine the department metaphysician coming into the philosophy department faculty meeting And the metaphysician is really concerned and says, I think we've got a real problem. I think that the right ontology just does not include such things as universities and philosophy departments. Now, what are we going to do here? Even the other members of the philosophy department, let alone everyone else in the university and in the wider world, the reaction you would expect from them would be amusement, right? Well, what does that suggest? It suggests that maybe we shouldn't be thinking that talk about philosophy departments and universities and the state of Arizona and so on needs to be understood as positing items that are supposed to be there in the mind-independent world. We all develop pretty sophisticated conceptual competence in wielding notions like that. And we all have a pretty good idea about the kinds of things that would constitute evidence for and against various claims, like the claim that the philosophy department at the University of Arizona has 12 faculty members. And does it matter to how we actually go about gathering evidence and verifying claims like that, whether or not the right ontology includes philosophy departments? Doesn't seem to matter very much. I mean, in a way, this is an insight that harks back to the days of logical positivism. The meaning of a statement is the method of its verification. Well, that's certainly overblown, but there's something in it, We all know how to verify the claim that the United States has exactly 12 states in it. And it doesn't matter whether there are such entities in the mind-independent world as the United States of America or the state of Tennessee. Later on, I came to extend this general way of thinking about truth, especially when I started getting worried about vagueness and the impossibility of ontological vagueness.
Yeah, very good. A few things. Someone might, you said some things there, but like someone might be concerned that when you talk about statements that are understood in this indirect correspondence way, or like statements about universities or countries or whatever, it might feel as if those don't need to have any connection to like what the world really is like. So like, but presumably they should. What is the connection there? Is it just that sort of connected to these statements we have ways of assessing them that don't involve necessarily some like indirect statement like this, or what would you? Do you understand what I'm getting at? Like, how is it sort of grounded
Sure, I
in
understand.
the world?
Yeah. This is why I wanted to call the approach indirect correspondence. The thought was that whether or not a given statement is correctly affirmable under contextually operative standards of affirmation does normally depend on how things are with the world, right? And in that sense, corresponds to the world when true and fails to correspond to the world when not true. But then the issue is just how does the world what are the ways the world might be that are ways under which it would be true that the United States of America has 12 states in it. And the thought is that these are ways the world might be that don't any of them involve the presence or absence in the correct ontology of such a thing as a nation. So the world is still supposed to, how the world is still supposed to matter. Now then the question, of course, is traditional metaphysics has hearkened after trying to get an account of how, how the world is in itself, right? And I still hanker after that too. But I mean, one apparent consequence of the impossibility of ontological vagueness is that the right story about the ontology, whatever it is, will not posit any vague objects or any vague properties at all.
Right, because
our book, we canvassed various possibilities, and we actually argued that the most plausible ontology of concrete things is that there's really just one, the big one, the whole cosmos, and that it doesn't literally, metaphysically speaking, divide up into parts at all. But that's just one alternative.
it's sort of like Schaffer style priority monism view. I guess I had a couple other questions on this. One of the, let me make sure I get this right. One of the conditions that you argue are sort of like mutually inconsistent in vagueness is this individualistic same status principle, which says that each item in a Similarity sequence has the same vague status as its immediate neighbors. What if someone were to say, well, I don't accept that, because for a lot of the members in that sequence, well, there's just no fact of the matter about what sort of status they have. Are you going to say, well, are you going to say that's the sort of status, or are you going to say that there's other problems with that sort of view? Or what if someone rejected this principle on those grounds, and maybe there was then some way to make it consistent? Do you get what I'm getting?
Yeah. Well, I guess I am going to want to say there are narrower and wider ways to use the word status. And in a pertinent wide way, no fact of the matter about whether it's true or false, for example, another status. No fact of the matter about whether the guy's bald or not, another status. And in any event, if we have an item where a given status is instantiated and the next item, that status is not instantiated, whatever else you say about the next item, no fact of the matter, whatever you say about the next one, you've marked a sharp boundary that seems to go contrary to the nature of vagueness.
What if you say it's kind of like vague boundaries all the way down? Is that intelligible? Or like there's no, between quote unquote those that are unambiguously there is a fact of the matter, and those for which there's like unambiguously no fact of the matter, there's no sharp cutoff between those. And if you want to look at further boundaries you might generate, saying, well, but then where does it be, then there's no fact of the matter. It's vague boundaries all the way down, so to speak. What if someone were to take this approach?
Yeah, I like that. That seems better than not taking that approach, because if you don't take that approach, then it looks like you're going to end up committing yourself to sharp boundaries in spite of yourself, even if you start multiplying categories and statuses. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to me that move eliminates the problem of incoherence, because the individualistic same status principle still seems to be operative. When you consider two items that are neighbors in the sequence, in the Similarity sequence, they've got to have the same status on pain of there otherwise being a sharp boundary between them that would go contrary to the nature of vagueness. So I don't think talk about vagueness all the way down eliminates the logical incoherence that I'm talking about. And maybe I should, there are various fancy formal approaches to vagueness, supervaluationism being maybe the best known of them. And I do think it's desirable to prevent Similarity's arguments from being employable in such a way that we end up committed to contradictions all over the place. And so there are ways to do that by adopting certain kinds of non-classical logics and semantics. From my point of view, any such approach, well, first of all, it should iterate at higher levels, higher meta language levels, because if it doesn't, if you get classical at a higher level, then you're going to be committing yourself to sharp boundaries at the higher level. So you should have the same machinery work all the way on up. But from my point of view, that is not a way of, that's not an alternative to supervaluationism. It's one way of implementing it. These formal approaches, especially when they're iterated like this, up through the metalinguistic hierarchy, are best viewed as potential implementations of the transvaluationist picture, not alternatives to the transvaluationist picture.
Right. Yeah, I'd have to think more about that. But what do you think about some other approaches to vagueness? So in particular, a few months ago, I talked with Timothy Williamson, who's, as you know, is well known for his epistemicist approach, according to which roughly, look, there really are kind of sharp boundaries in the predicates we use, even if we're not always aware of, you know, what those sharp boundaries are. Do you think there's any plausibility to this approach, or what would you say?
It seems awfully implausible to me. And the reason why is that I think the question that looms really heavily is, in virtue of what is it the case that the sharp boundaries are there and are where they are? And I can't see anywhere in the vicinity the makings of a plausible answer to that. You know, sometimes Williamson talks about our overall pattern of usage, but I just don't see that our overall pattern of usage works in such a way as to determine fixed sharp boundaries. You know, I know they're supposed to be unknowable sharp boundaries, but I don't understand what could plausibly be doing the boundary fixing in the first place. I did want to write a piece where I was commenting on a presentation by Williamson where I posed this worry.
Yeah, I mean, presumably something, what fixes the boundaries, if there are any, should have something to do with our semantic practices or something about our psychology. You know, that should be part of the story of what fixes it. But how is it fixing it at all in these cases? It just seems kind of obvious that it doesn't. Our semantic practices don't precisely fix, you know, how many hairs a person can have and still be bald or something like that.
That's exactly my thought. Yeah.
Right. But then what is fixing it if not those things? It seems like there's nothing to say. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I guess someone could say that something like, well, there is this, you know, Platonistic concept, bald or something like that. And that concept has these precise boundary conditions. And somehow we're latching on to that in some way. But then the question is like, well, even aside from concerns about that someone might have about the Platonistic view like this, why think that when we're using the word bald or when we are employing the concept that we have, that it's that quote unquote Platonistic concept that we're latching onto and so on? And it seems like we just have the same problem.
Yep. So it seems to me, I'm fully in agreement with that thought. And that's why I find epistemicism so implausible. On the other hand, it does seem to me that if you stare vagueness in the face, and to me, staring it in the face makes you realize that there's this looming kind of incoherence that I was talking about that's built right into it, that has very heavyweight consequences for how to think about semantics and how to think about metaphysics. And for this reason, I think that, to my mind, the the most philosophically fraught paradox that I've ever encountered is the Sorites paradox. And I think here we're talking about, as I said, a deep antinomy of pure reason. And it's a deep one. It's not a mere illusion of conflict between normative principles that govern the concept. It's a real conflict.
Yeah, it really does seem significant. It draws in a lot of things. I think one of the points you made is like, there's a lot of paradoxes or problems that are like this that have been around for a long time. And you look at some other ones, like the liar paradox, that's gotten a lot more attention, generally speaking. But in a way, this one's like more significant, or at least comparably significant. It should be because of its implications for all these other things, logic, semantics, truth, metaphysics, and so on. It's something we should be taking, ontology, something we should be taking very seriously.
I certainly think so. You know, Quine wrote a famous essay called The Ways of Paradox, and he started it off with an epigraph quoting somebody who said something like, "How quaint the ways of paradox." And Quine ends his essay by saying, "Of all the ways of the paradoxes, perhaps the quaintest is their tendency on occasion to be so very much less frivolous than they seem." And Quine didn't even mention the Sorites paradox in that essay, which just underscores the point.
Yeah. All right, I guess we could be here all day, but I don't want to keep you too long. So I think I want to give kind of one more question that I often do to wrap up. What do you think about like what the value of philosophy is in general, like maybe to you specifically, or to society more generally? What's the value of philosophy, would you say? I know it's a kind of broad question, but I mean,
Right.
What do you think?
Right. Well, for me, there are lots of answers there. I think that in general, probably studying philosophy does people good in terms of getting them to be able to reason more sharply, and in general, maybe to tend to be better and more sympathetic people. Of course, there's no guarantee that studying philosophy will do that, but I suspect it has a tendency to do it. And so if a lot of people do it, then that could benefit society that much more. So that's a utilitarian kind of value. To me, there's great value in acquiring knowledge and acquiring understanding across disciplines and fields, including acquiring knowledge and acquiring understanding regarding the problems that arise in philosophy. And I would say that, you know, there's a form of understanding which is less than the full-blown ideal. I think it's valuable to understand why philosophical problems are as fraught as they are, as hard as they are, as perennially and persistently disputed as they are. So there's value in understanding why philosophical problems are hard problems. And I do think that sometimes, to some extent, we get at least partial resolutions of them. And so then we have that further kind of understanding. I also find the issues just intrinsically fascinating, and I get great personal satisfaction out of thinking about them and working on them. And I'll just add one more thing. It's not that common in our field for people to collaborate. I collaborate a lot, and I always have. And there's a particular value in that for me. The value of collaborative philosophical inquiry is something that I get all the more satisfaction out of. And I also happen to think that the discipline would benefit from more collaborative inquiry. In this respect, it seems to me it's similar to mathematics. I knew a guy back at the University of Memphis, where I used to be, a mathematician, who they had a guy who spent about a month a year there, but he's traveled the world constantly and never had a home. His name was Paul Erdős. He was the most prolific published mathematician in history. And he just traveled around visiting people and working on mathematics with them. And this guy told me that Erdős single-handedly almost changed the whole culture of mathematics. Mathematicians used to work primarily by themselves. And because of the influence of Erdős, they collaborate all the time. It seems to me philosophy is like relevantly similar to math. People can really make progress when they put their heads together. I think there should be more of that.
Yeah, that's a lot of great points there. I know there's this concern in philosophy and elsewhere. It's like your certain fields or even certain people within those fields can become sort of siloed off from those working even in their field or in related fields, and having more collaboration, interdisciplinary work that can be incredibly productive and rewarding. Yeah, so I think with that, that'll be the end of the questions. Thanks so much, Professor Horgan, for being here and taking my questions and providing your detailed and thoughtful responses. It's been great having you.
Great, thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.